What if the most famous secret in horse racing was not Secretariat's speed, not his 31-length Belmont, not even the records that still refuse to die, but something hidden inside his chest? For decades, fans have repeated the same jaw-dropping claim, that when Secretariat died, veterinarians discovered a heart so enormous it explained everything. A heart supposedly nearly 3 times the size of a normal thoroughbred's. A heart so massive it turned a champion into a myth. But here is where the story gets dangerous and fascinating. Was Secretariat's heart really weighed? Was the famous 22-pound number ever formally confirmed? Or did one astonishing veterinary observation slowly harden into racing folklore because the world wanted a physical explanation for a horse who looked almost supernatural on the track? In this video, we are going beyond the legend. We are separating what was actually said, what was later repeated, and what may have grown larger with every retelling. Because the truth about Secretariat's giant heart is even more interesting than the myth. And by the end of this story, you may never hear the phrase "heart of a champion" the same way again. Before the myth, why Secretariat already looked inhuman on the track. Long before anyone spoke about a giant heart, Secretariat had already done something even more dangerous to the imagination. He made people believe they were watching a horse who did not belong to ordinary racing reality. This was not just a champion winning races. This was a chestnut colt moving with such force, rhythm, and command that even seasoned horsemen struggled to describe what they were seeing. In the Kentucky Derby, he ran each quarter mile faster than the one before it, something almost absurd at that level of competition. In the Preakness, he delivered another record performance. And then came the Belmont Stakes, the race that turned admiration into awe. Secretariat did not merely defeat the field, he destroyed the boundaries of what a racehorse was supposed to be. He won by 31 lengths, stopping the clock in 2 minutes and 24 seconds, a time no horse has ever touched in that race since. The announcer's words, "moving like a tremendous machine," became immortal because they felt inadequate and perfect at the same time. And that is exactly why the giant heart story took hold so easily later. People were not searching for gossip, they were searching for an explanation. Because when a horse runs like that, the world cannot resist asking what made him different. The day the legend was born, Secretariat's death, and the necropsy. The giant heart story did not begin in the winner's circle, or in the roar of Belmont Park, or in the mythology that surrounded Secretariat while he was still alive. It began in grief. In October of 1989, Secretariat was euthanized after a painful battle with laminitis, the devastating hoof disease that has ended the lives of far too many great horses. By then, he was already immortal in racing memory, the Triple Crown champion, the record breaker, the chestnut force of nature people still spoke about with something close to reverence. But it was only after his death, when veterinarian Dr. Thomas Swerczek performed the necropsy, that the story took on an entirely new dimension. What he reportedly found stunned him. Secretariat's heart, he said, appeared vastly larger than normal, so large that even a veterinarian who had examined thousands of horses considered it unlike anything he had seen before. In that instant, the public gained something irresistible, a physical clue to explain an almost superhuman athlete. And that is the exact moment where history and legend began to merge. Because once people heard that the greatest racehorse of the modern era might also have carried an astonishingly oversized heart, the story stopped being just about how Secretariat ran. It became about what, physically, might have made him seem almost impossible. What Dr. Thomas Swerczek actually said, estimated, not formally weighed. This is the point where the story becomes truly interesting, because this is where hard fact begins to blur into repetition, and repetition begins to look like certainty. For years, people have said the same thing with absolute confidence. Secretariat's heart weighed 22 pounds, not might have, not appeared to, not was estimated at. They say it as if someone placed the organ on a scale, wrote the number down, and closed the case forever. But that is not the careful version of the story. The careful version is more subtle and, in some ways, more powerful. Dr. Thomas Swerczek, the veterinarian who performed the necropsy, said Secretariat's heart appeared dramatically larger than normal, unlike anything he had seen in thousands of horse examinations. He described it as almost twice average size, perhaps over 20 pounds, and said it was not pathologically enlarged, just exceptionally big. That distinction matters, because an expert estimate is not the same thing as a formal documented measurement. And once you understand that difference, the giant heart story changes. It does not collapse. It becomes more complicated, more human, more believable. What survives is not a neat number carved in stone, but a professional witness saying, in effect, I saw something extraordinary. And sometimes, that kind of testimony is exactly how legends begin, how 22 pounds became gospel, the power of repetition. Once a great horse becomes a legend, the world begins to prefer certainty over nuance. And that is exactly what happened to Secretariat's heart, a careful veterinary impression that the organ appeared extraordinarily large, perhaps over 20 pounds, and unlike anything Dr. Thomas Swerczek had seen before, slowly hardened into something far more absolute. Secretariat's heart weighed 22 pounds, not estimated, not approximated, not remembered through testimony, weighed, confirmed, settled, and once that version took hold, it spread because it was simply too perfect to resist. It gave fans a number they could repeat, writers a symbol they could dramatize, and racing culture a physical explanation for a horse who already seemed beyond normal explanation. The average thoroughbred heart is often cited at around 8.5 to 9 pounds, so the contrast was irresistible. A champion with a heart nearly 3 times the ordinary size felt like the kind of truth that should belong to a horse like Secretariat. Even respected institutions helped reinforce the simplified version, repeating the claim in ways that made the estimate sound more definite than the underlying evidence actually was. And that is how folklore often works. It does not begin as a lie. It begins as a powerful story told so many times that doubt quietly disappears, and wonder takes its place. The X Factor, when a legend became a breeding theory. This is the chapter where Secretariat's giant heart story stopped being just a fascinating necropsy detail and became something far bigger, a theory, a system, almost a quest. Once people accepted that Secretariat may have possessed an unusually large heart, the next question came almost immediately. Could that kind of greatness be inherited? That question gave rise to what became known as the X Factor theory, most famously promoted by Mariana Horn, who argued that exceptional heart size could be passed along certain maternal lines through the X chromosome. Suddenly, Secretariat's heart was no longer just a clue about one extraordinary horse. It became, in the minds of many breeders and believers, a possible key to reproducing brilliance itself. And you can understand why the idea spread. Horse racing is a sport obsessed with the mystery of inheritance, always searching for the hidden ingredient that separates champions from merely talented horses. The X Factor offered something irresistibly seductive, a way to turn legend into lineage, wonder into a pattern, myth into a breeding roadmap. Books were written, pedigrees were re-examined, bloodlines were debated with almost religious intensity. But this is also where the story becomes most vulnerable to overreach. Because the moment a legend becomes a formula, people stop asking whether it is beautiful and start asking whether it is proven, and those are not the same thing. The pushback. Why science says Secretariat's greatness was never that simple. This is where the legend meets its hardest question. Even if Secretariat's heart was truly enormous, even if Dr. Thomas Swerczek's estimate was essentially correct, does that actually explain a horse like Secretariat? Science, at least serious science, says not so fast. Because greatness on a racetrack is never the result of one spectacular organ acting alone. A large heart may help. It may increase cardiovascular capacity, improve oxygen delivery, and support stamina. But a racehorse is not a single measurement. He is lungs, stride, bone, muscle, conformation, efficiency, temperament, recovery, competitive instinct, and the mysterious ability to deliver all of it under pressure on one specific afternoon. That complexity matters. In fact, the story gets even more interesting when you learn that the second largest equine heart Dr. Thomas Swerczek said he ever saw belonged not to another immortal champion, but to Sham, Secretariat's brilliant and unlucky rival. Sham was a magnificent horse, but he was not Secretariat, and that single comparison shatters the comforting fantasy that one giant heart can fully explain one giant legend. It suggests something much more powerful, that Secretariat's physical gifts were extraordinary, yes, but his greatness came from the total package. The giant heart may be part of the story. It was never the whole story, the final verdict, fact, exaggeration, or racing folklore. So where does the truth finally land? Not at either extreme, not in the cold certainty of pure science, and not in the unchecked romance of legend. The strongest, most honest verdict is this. The story of Secretariat's giant heart is part fact, part exaggeration, and part racing folklore. The factual core is real. Dr. Thomas Swerczek, the veterinarian who performed Secretariat's necropsy, did report seeing a heart of extraordinary size, far beyond the norm, structurally normal, and unlike anything he had seen in thousands of examinations. That alone is enough to make the story remarkable. But the exaggeration enters when an expert estimate becomes repeated as a perfectly documented measurement, and when one extraordinary observation is treated as the complete explanation for one of the greatest athletes who ever lived. Then comes the folklore, the part where the heart stops being just an organ and becomes a symbol, a shorthand for courage, stamina, destiny, and the almost supernatural feelings Secretariat gave people when they watched him run. In the end, maybe that is why this story survives. Not because it solves the mystery of Secretariat, but because it preserves it. His heart may indeed have been unusually large, but the full truth of Secretariat was always bigger than any number could hold.